What if the story you've always been told about the Bible is incomplete? What if black people, whose presence shaped history, have been erased from the most powerful narrative in the world? Imagine the psychological toll of growing up disconnected from the very texts that many believe define your place in the world. Today, we dive deep into how the erasure of black people from biblical history affects mental health, identity, and the sense of belonging. Stay with me as we uncover the layers of this painful history and reveal how reclaiming these lost stories can heal generations. The psychological impact of erasing black people from biblical history is far-reaching, affecting not only individual identity but also the collective mental and spiritual health of entire communities. The Bible has long been considered a source of identity, guidance, and divine truth for millions of people. For black individuals, especially those raised in Christian households, the Bible holds a place of immense significance, providing a framework for understanding their connection to God, to one another, and to the world. However, when the Bible and its teachings ignore or misrepresent black people, it leads to a deep psychological disconnection. Black people are often taught that they have little or no place in biblical history, which leads to feelings of invisibility, erasure, and most damaging of all, a lack of spiritual self-worth. This absence is not just about being left out of stories. It's about the subtle yet powerful messaging that black people are somehow unworthy of representation in the divine narrative. Over time, these messages contribute to feelings of inferiority and confusion about one's place in the spiritual world. When individuals grow up without seeing themselves in these powerful religious texts, it becomes harder to relate to the broader story of humanity's spiritual journey. This psychological disconnect does more than simply affect one's faith. It impacts the way individuals see themselves in relation to God and to their community. When biblical stories are centered around figures who do not look like you, it can lead to spiritual alienation. The Bible becomes a distant text, something for others, but not for you. This spiritual alienation can also lead to issues with self-esteem, as individuals internalize the message that they do not belong in the grand narrative of God's plan. For generations, this has shaped the identity of black Christians, forcing them to either reconcile with this erasure or to seek out alternative ways of understanding their connection to the divine. Furthermore, when these erasures persist, they become part of a collective trauma. The effects aren't just personal, they're deeply woven into the fabric of the community. Black people, who have historically faced marginalization, oppression, and systemic racism, have also faced a cultural and spiritual erasure. This history of exclusion leads to a sense of fragmentation, both in the way individuals see themselves and in how communities relate to the larger religious and spiritual world. The erasure of black people from biblical history is not just a matter of exclusion from a book, but a reflection of a broader societal issue that has plagued black communities for centuries. To understand the psychological impact, we need to first consider the role of the Bible in shaping self-identity and communal understanding. For most of the world, the Bible is more than a spiritual guide. It is a cultural touchstone, a text that helps shape values, moral beliefs, and worldviews. From childhood, many individuals are taught the Bible is the ultimate source of truth, not just for spiritual matters, but for shaping who they are, where they come from, and where they are going. For black people, this process becomes problematic when the Bible fails to acknowledge their existence in any meaningful way. The stories of Adam and Eve, Abraham, Moses, and the apostles seem distant and foreign, not because they are difficult to understand, but because they seem to exclude black people from the narrative of human history altogether. In the Bible, there is little representation of black figures. The few African characters mentioned, such as the descendants of Ham, are often misrepresented or ignored. This absence means that Black individuals are forced to either search for alternative forms of representation or, worse, accept the notion that they are somehow unimportant in God's plan. Psychologically, this lack of representation has severe consequences. Identity formation is a process that relies on seeing oneself reflected in the stories and histories around us. When people cannot see themselves in the most influential spiritual and cultural narratives, it leads to a sense of being forgotten, invisible, or even inferior. For Black people, this means a generation growing up without the spiritual strength that comes from knowing that their ancestors, their culture, and their race are part of the greater divine story. This is a form of spiritual disconnection that can take decades, if not lifetimes, to heal. This kind of erasure is more than just an academic or theological issue. It is a matter of mental health. The messages that children receive about their worth, whether overtly or through subtle cues, shape their view of themselves, their possibilities, and their sense of connection to the divine. When those messages consistently tell Black children that they have no place in the Bible, that their history is irrelevant to the sacred text, it affects their sense of spiritual belonging. This isn't just about a book. It's about the internalized messages of exclusion, and it deeply impacts how Black people relate to the church, to their faith, and to their own identity. Moreover, when the Bible, the cornerstone of Christianity, is stripped of the diverse histories that could have empowered Black individuals, the spiritual nourishment that the text offers becomes hollow. The absence of meaningful representation creates a vacuum, and in that space, feelings of inadequacy, spiritual doubt, and confusion flourish. For generations, Black Christians have had to grapple with these feelings, navigating the tension between a faith that is central to their identity and a religious tradition that has failed to fully acknowledge their place in it. The deeper psychological effect of this is a fractured sense of spiritual self-worth that extends beyond religious practice, bleeding into everyday life, impacting self-esteem, and ultimately shaping Black people's relationship with the world. To understand the deep psychological effects of erasure, it's important to recognize how these historical distortions affect the mental and emotional well-being of individuals and communities. The Bible has long been a source of strength, wisdom, and identity for people all over the world. For Black people, the Bible is not just a spiritual text. It's a blueprint for understanding their connection to the divine, to one another, and to their place in the world. But when the Bible excludes or distorts the roles of Black people in its narratives, it leaves a gaping hole in the identity of Black believers. This is not just about feeling overlooked. It's about spiritual identity being fundamentally altered. When Black people do not see themselves represented in sacred texts, they begin to question their value, not only in the context of religion, but in society as a whole. The absence of Black figures in the Bible creates a dangerous narrative of invisibility. If the most revered text in history does not acknowledge your presence, then it can lead to the feeling that you do not matter. For generations, this erasure has fueled negative self-perceptions, undermining Black people's sense of spiritual belonging and dignity. One of the most devastating effects of this erasure is the spiritual fragmentation it causes. People rely on religious texts like the Bible to form their worldview and make sense of their place in the world. It's a guide to understanding one's purpose, legacy, and connection to the divine. But when an entire people group is erased or misrepresented in those texts, it creates a fracture in their spiritual foundation. The stories of their ancestors, their heritage, and their divine destiny are erased or ignored, leaving them with a sense of disconnection from both their religious faith and their cultural heritage. This disconnection isn't just a theological problem, it's a deeply emotional one. For those growing up in religious communities, the Bible shapes everything from self-worth to life's purpose. But when the characters and figures they are told to emulate and learn from are predominantly white, male, or of a different cultural background, it sends the message that their own identity is secondary. This is a blow to the psychological well-being of Black children and adults who may grow up feeling they don't belong in the divine narrative. Over time, this can lead to confusion about one's identity, a lack of spiritual direction, and the loss of confidence in one's cultural and ancestral heritage. Additionally, the psychological impact is compounded when historical misinterpretations and theological distortions are passed down. For centuries, the idea that Black people were cursed through the lineage of Ham, a misinterpretation of biblical verses, has been used to justify slavery and discrimination. This notion has been ingrained in the minds of many, creating deep internal conflict. How can someone feel valued in their faith when they are repeatedly told that their lineage is cursed or inferior? This belief not only impacts an individual's sense of self-worth, but also affects their relationship with their faith community, and by extension, their broader place in society. The psychological toll of this belief has lingered, passed down through generations, continuing to affect the mental health of Black people today. The emotional scars caused by this kind of erasure are not easy to heal. They require a multifaceted approach, including the reclaiming of biblical narratives, the restoration of spiritual identity, and the education of future generations on the true, inclusive nature of the Bible. Black people must see themselves in the Bible not as passive figures in the background, but as active participants in the divine story. Reclaiming this space in the Bible is not just about spiritual fulfillment. It's about healing generations of psychological damage and affirming that Black people, in all their diversity, are woven into the very fabric of the biblical narrative. Through this process of reclamation, the psychological impact of exclusion can begin to heal. By embracing the truth of Black representation in the Bible, whether it's through the recognition of African nations in biblical history, the acknowledgement of Black biblical figures, or the understanding of Black contributions to the faith, individuals can begin to rebuild their spiritual identity. When this is done, the resulting empowerment can transform not only individual lives but entire communities, as they reclaim their rightful place in the divine narrative, restoring their sense of dignity and self-worth. The psychological effects of erasure don't only manifest in personal identity, but also in the way Black people engage with society as a whole. For centuries, Black individuals have been excluded not just from religious narratives, but from many historical and cultural discussions. The Bible, as one of the most influential books in shaping societal values and moral frameworks, has been an essential part of this process. Its narratives are used to set moral standards, define community roles, and shape the ways in which people view themselves and their relationships to others. When Black people are erased from this powerful framework, they face a challenge that extends beyond personal identity. This erasure affects their social and cultural engagement too. In many ways, the exclusion of Black people from biblical history reinforces the larger societal structures that have historically marginalized them. If you are repeatedly told that your identity has no place in the most revered spiritual text, it's no surprise that this affects how you view your worth in the broader social structure. The psychological impact becomes more complex when one considers the historical and social implications of biblical exclusion. For generations, the absence of Black people in biblical stories has been part of the narrative that has justified the marginalization and oppression of Black communities. For example, in the context of Western societies, Christianity has often been used as a tool to maintain social hierarchies. The exclusion or misrepresentation of black people in biblical history allowed for the development of ideologies that placed black individuals at the bottom of the social ladder. These ideologies were reinforced through religious teachings, sermons, and interpretations of the Bible that perpetuated harmful stereotypes. Over time, these distorted teachings not only led to racial discrimination and injustice, but also played a crucial role in shaping how black people were seen by others in society. This exclusion has led to a phenomenon often referred to as internalized racism, where marginalized individuals begin to internalize negative societal views about themselves. Black individuals who grow up not seeing themselves represented in biblical narratives may unconsciously adopt the belief that they are inferior or lesser in the eyes of God. This idea can lead to a diminished sense of self-worth and, over time, a lack of confidence in their ability to shape their own futures. Internalized racism, perpetuated by the erasure of black people from sacred texts, becomes a tool of self-oppression that harms black people not just spiritually, but mentally and socially. Furthermore, the erasure creates a disconnect between black people and the broader Christian community. When black people are not represented in biblical stories or misrepresented as cursed or inferior, they struggle to see Christianity as their own religion. This can create a rift within religious communities, where black people may feel alienated from their faith or unable to fully embrace it. Instead of viewing Christianity as a source of empowerment, it can sometimes feel like an external system that doesn't align with their lived experiences. This lack of representation can also make it harder for black people to find role models within the church or spiritual community. Figures who reflect their experiences, struggles, and strengths. This alienation from faith can result in a loss of spiritual fulfillment. When black people don't see themselves in biblical history, they may begin to question whether Christianity is for them or whether they can truly belong in the spiritual community. This leads to an emotional and spiritual void, where individuals feel disconnected from their heritage, culture, and divine purpose. The church, which is supposed to be a place of community and belonging, can instead become a place of exclusion. This psychological rift between black individuals and the church further exacerbates the mental health crisis within black communities, where feelings of isolation and spiritual disconnection are all too common. The process of reclaiming black presence in the Bible is not just about restoring historical truth. It's about reuniting people with their divine identity. This involves not only recognizing the important role black people played in biblical history, but also challenging the harmful ideologies that have perpetuated their erasure. By restoring these figures to their rightful place in the Bible, black people can begin to heal the psychological wounds caused by centuries of exclusion and find a renewed sense of purpose, pride, and connection to their faith. Reclaiming biblical history is not just about correcting the past. It's about restoring a sense of spiritual belonging that can empower future generations to live with confidence and purpose. To truly understand the long-lasting impact of biblical erasure on black individuals, we need to look at the deeper psychological effects that stem from these historical omissions. One of the most significant consequences is the loss of cultural and ancestral pride. For centuries, black communities have been subjected to narratives that strip away their agency, their contributions to history, and their rightful place in spiritual matters. The Bible, which is meant to be a source of strength and inspiration, becomes a mirror that doesn't reflect them. This exclusion from such a central and powerful narrative erodes the sense of pride that comes from knowing that your ancestors played an essential role in shaping history. The absence of black figures in the Bible, figures like the Queen of Sheba, the Ethiopian eunuch, and even Moses, whose story has deep African ties, leaves a gaping hole in the collective understanding of who black people are. These are not just historical figures, but symbols of the strength, wisdom, and leadership that black people have always possessed. When these figures are erased or minimized, black communities are deprived of role models who reflect their identity and experiences. The result is a loss of cultural connection that extends beyond religion and affects black people's relationship with their history, culture, and ancestral roots. This absence can also create a deep sense of spiritual dislocation. Black people are often taught that their faith, as expressed in the Bible, is tied to a cultural and racial identity that is not their own. When they are repeatedly told that biblical figures do not look like them or share their cultural heritage, it diminishes the significance of the Bible as a source of spiritual connection. The feeling that their place in the Bible is marginalized or erased results in a fragmented understanding of who they are in relation to God's divine plan. This fragmented spiritual identity can cause confusion, doubt, and even a crisis of faith. For those who find comfort and strength in the Bible, the knowledge that it does not fully include them can create a painful internal conflict between their religious beliefs and their racial identity. Additionally, this erasure has implications beyond individual spiritual struggles. The collective consciousness of black communities is shaped by both personal and communal experiences of exclusion and marginalization. Generations of black people have been raised with a limited or distorted understanding of their role in biblical history, and this affects how they see themselves in relation to society. The sense of exclusion from the biblical narrative reinforces societal perceptions that black people are lesser or less significant. This psychological harm is passed down, creating a cycle of diminished self-worth that is internalized over generations. When black people are not represented in religious texts or spiritual traditions, they are left to wonder if they are seen or valued by God. The absence of role models within the Bible leads to confusion about one's place in the larger narrative of humanity. This sense of invisibility can diminish a person's confidence in their worth, not only spiritually but socially. It fosters the belief that their lives, their contributions, and their cultural heritage do not matter. In a world that already devalues black people in many ways, this erasure serves as another painful reminder of the systemic forces that seek to silence and marginalize them. Moreover, this erasure isn't just psychological, it is deeply emotional. The Bible is a book of promises, of hope, and of a future that God has for His people. For black individuals, the message of the Bible has often felt distant, disconnected from their reality. The stories of freedom, deliverance, and redemption that fill its pages are inspiring, but don't seem to include them as participants in that journey. The emotional pain of not seeing one's reflection in the sacred text results in an alienation that makes it harder to claim the promises of the Bible as one's own. This feeling of spiritual and cultural dislocation can lead to the search for identity in other places, sometimes in unhealthy ways. When people do not see themselves in the Bible, they may turn to secular or distorted spiritual practices for validation and guidance. While there is value in many different forms of self-expression and belief systems, the absence of biblical representation leaves black individuals vulnerable to these substitutes, which may not offer the same healing, hope, or sense of divine purpose that true spiritual connection with the Bible can provide. Ultimately, reclaiming black people's rightful place in biblical history is not just an academic exercise. It's a necessary step for healing the psychological and emotional wounds that have been inflicted for centuries. Restoring these figures to their rightful place is not only an act of historical justice, but an act of spiritual restoration. It allows Black individuals and communities to reconnect with their divine inheritance, understand their role in God's plan, and restore their sense of spiritual identity. This process can heal the deep-rooted trauma that has been passed down for generations, rebuilding the broken connection between faith, culture, and identity. Reclaiming biblical history is about more than correcting the record. It's about restoring the dignity, pride, and spiritual fulfillment that Black people deserve. The psychological toll of erasure is further compounded when Black people are not just excluded from biblical history, but are instead subjected to harmful, distorted representations within religious narratives. These misrepresentations not only perpetuate stereotypes, but also reinforce a sense of inferiority. For centuries, biblical interpretations and teachings have been manipulated to justify the marginalization and enslavement of Black people. One of the most enduring and damaging misinterpretations is the so-called Curse of Ham, a biblical story that has been used to justify the enslavement of African people by misreading the curse placed on Ham's descendants. This distortion has been embedded in religious teachings, reinforcing the idea that Black people are cursed or inherently inferior. The impact of this teaching cannot be overstated. The Curse of Ham doctrine was used as theological justification for the transatlantic slave trade, perpetuating centuries of racial oppression. It was taught that people of African descent were not only physically different, but also spiritually cursed, destined for servitude. For Black people, growing up with the belief that their ancestors were cursed in the eyes of God creates deep spiritual confusion and emotional pain. If your own identity is framed as the result of divine punishment, how can you embrace your worth and your place in God's kingdom? This kind of theological distortion cuts to the core of self-identity, leaving a lasting impact on mental health and spiritual well-being. In addition to these harmful interpretations, there is a long history of misrepresenting Black people in religious texts and imagery. Historically, the portrayal of biblical figures as white or European has further excluded Black people from seeing themselves as part of the divine narrative. From Jesus to the apostles, biblical figures have often been depicted in ways that deny their true Middle Eastern and African roots. This inaccurate portrayal distorts the rich cultural and racial diversity of biblical times, making it difficult for Black people to find images that reflect their own features or history within Christianity. The psychological effect of this is that Black people are forced to see divinity and sacredness as qualities that belong to someone else, reinforcing the idea that spirituality and holiness are disconnected from their own identity. This issue is particularly poignant in the context of modern Christianity, where religious education, church teachings, and even the way biblical figures are depicted in art and media all continue to center whiteness. The overwhelming dominance of whitewashed religious imagery reinforces the belief that Black people don't belong in the biblical story, that they have no divine connection to the most important religious figures in history. The result is a faith experience that feels alienating, disconnected, and unwelcoming. For many Black Christians, the Bible and the church no longer feel like a place of refuge, but a space that denies their full identity as both children of God and descendants of a long, proud lineage. This continuous cycle of exclusion and misrepresentation deepens the psychological wounds caused by the erasure of Black people from biblical history. The absence of accurate biblical depictions and the presence of distorted religious interpretations perpetuate feelings of worthlessness and spiritual disconnection. It fosters an environment where Black people may struggle to see their own lives, struggles, and successes as part of a divine plan. They are left with an incomplete or skewed understanding of God's promise to all His people, unable to fully claim their place in that narrative. This erasure and misrepresentation create a sense of spiritual emptiness that no external affirmation can easily fill. The power of accurate representation, on the other hand, can be transformative. When Black people are able to see themselves in the pages of the Bible, when they can recognize their ancestors as part of the divine story, it can provide a profound sense of validation and empowerment. The psychological impact of reclaiming these narratives is immense, as it reestablishes a connection to spiritual and cultural roots that have been severed for far too long. Restoring accurate representation allows Black individuals to see their spiritual potential, to embrace their worth in the eyes of God, and to rebuild their identity within the framework of a more inclusive, truthful, biblical history. Restoring the true role of Black people in the Bible and in Christian history is not just a matter of correcting the past. It's about healing the deep psychological scars that have been left by centuries of exclusion and misrepresentation. It's about making the Bible and the Christian faith a place where Black people can feel truly seen, heard, and valued. This healing process requires acknowledging the past, confronting the false narratives, and actively working to restore the spiritual and historical truths that affirm the inherent dignity and worth of every Black person. Reclaiming these stories is about more than spiritual restoration. It's a journey of self-love, cultural pride, and healing for the generations to come. The psychological damage caused by the erasure of Black people from biblical history is not something that can be easily fixed with simple acknowledgement. It runs deep into the collective consciousness of Black communities, affecting how individuals view their place in the world, how they connect with their spirituality, and how they see themselves in the larger narrative of humanity. The impact is generational, passing down through families, churches, and communities, often leaving individuals unaware of the full extent of the damage. This erasure has created a distorted sense of identity, leaving many Black people with a fractured understanding of their own history and place in God's plan. When Black people are excluded from biblical history, it not only creates feelings of spiritual and cultural disconnection, but it also deepens the sense of powerlessness that has been perpetuated through centuries of systemic oppression. The stories of resilience, strength, and divine favor that should serve as spiritual and cultural beacons are made inaccessible. Without these stories, it's easy to feel like your struggles, whether they are spiritual, emotional, or societal, are somehow disconnected from the larger purpose of life. When you're not reflected in the sacred narrative, you begin to question your significance. This leads to a diminished sense of self-worth, where Black individuals may start to believe that their worth is not recognized by God, or that their place in the divine story is non-existent. The Bible has always served as a guide for people, offering them both comfort and conviction. But for Black people, the absence of representation in that narrative means that the Bible often feels like a book that's not for them. This isn't just about the lack of Black figures in biblical history. It's about the absence of a relatable connection. Black people are left to reconcile their faith with the idea that the sacred texts were not written with their history, culture, or identity in mind. The internal conflict between wanting to claim a place within the Bible's teachings and feeling excluded from its story can result in a spiritual void that is hard to fill. For generations, Black communities have been taught to engage with the Bible in a way that requires them to overlook their own history and spiritual significance. This leads to cognitive dissonance, where their sense of self-worth is undermined by the very texts that should affirm it. It's also essential to understand the social impact of this exclusion. The lack of black representation in biblical history contributes to the broader societal narrative that perpetuates racial inequality. In a world where racial stereotypes and systemic racism still run rampant, the absence of black people in the Bible has reinforced the false belief that black people are inferior or secondary. These societal beliefs are not just theoretical. They have real-world consequences on how black people are treated, both in the church and in society. When the Bible and its teachings are distorted to fit these harmful stereotypes, it deepens the sense of disempowerment that black individuals feel in their daily lives. They are left to navigate a world where they are made to feel inferior, even when their faith and their history have always been tied to the divine narrative. The psychological scars from this erasure extend beyond individual identity struggles. They affect community cohesion as well. The church, which should serve as a place of refuge, healing, and empowerment, often becomes a space where black people feel disconnected. The exclusion of black figures in church teachings makes it harder for black individuals to see themselves reflected in the faith they're supposed to practice. This disconnection weakens the community bond within the church and, in many cases, leads to an erosion of trust. If a church is supposed to reflect God's love for all people, but fails to reflect black people in its teachings and sacred history, it sends the message that they do not belong. This lack of representation isn't just spiritually damaging. It has a ripple effect on the way black people engage with their faith, with each other, and with society. But there is hope. By acknowledging this erasure and actively working to restore black people's rightful place in biblical history, the psychological damage can begin to heal. The process begins with reclaiming black presence in the Bible, not as secondary figures, but as essential parts of the narrative. It's about restoring stories of black resilience, wisdom, and divine favor, and making sure these stories are seen and heard in the context of Christian faith. For instance, the Ethiopian eunuch, a prominent figure in the New Testament, and the Queen of Sheba, whose wisdom was revered in the biblical account, can no longer be minimized or ignored. These are figures whose contributions should be celebrated and highlighted in the Christian tradition. Restoring black representation in biblical history allows black individuals to reconnect with the divine narrative. It affirms that their lives, struggles, and victories are part of the greater story of God's work in the world. This process of spiritual and psychological restoration will help black people reclaim their place within the Bible, renew their faith, and heal the wounds caused by centuries of exclusion. It is a necessary step toward dismantling the false beliefs that have held black people back, both spiritually and socially. When black individuals can see themselves fully reflected in the Bible, they can begin to embrace their divine purpose and live with the confidence that they are an integral part of God's story. A story that is meant for everyone, without exception. The process of healing from this erasure requires more than just acknowledgement. It calls for action and intentional steps to restore black people's place in biblical history. This restoration is not merely an academic exercise. It's about addressing the deep psychological and spiritual wounds caused by centuries of exclusion. In order to begin healing, we must first confront the historical and theological distortions that have been perpetuated over time. One of the most important steps is challenging the false narrative that has been built around the curse of Ham, which has been used to justify the enslavement and oppression of black people. For generations, this misinterpretation has been taught in churches and religious communities, distorting both the Bible and the identity of black people. The curse of Ham has been wrongly associated with the curse of servitude, leading to the justification of racial discrimination. It is essential to return to the original biblical text and understand the true meaning of the passage. When we do this, we see that the curse was not directed at black people, but rather at specific individuals: Canaan, the son of Ham. The misapplication of this curse to an entire race has had devastating consequences for black people, both spiritually and psychologically. Correcting this error in biblical interpretation is a crucial step in restoring black people's rightful place in biblical history. Beyond correcting theological misinterpretations, we must also work to ensure that black representation is integrated into the broader narrative of the Bible. This includes not only acknowledging the figures that have been traditionally erased or minimized, but also celebrating their roles in God's story. Figures like the Queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon and was recognized for her wisdom, and the Ethiopian eunuch, who played a pivotal role in the spread of Christianity, must be acknowledged for their significance. These figures, and many others, should be highlighted in biblical teachings, sermons, and religious education. By restoring their presence, we show that black people have always been integral to the story of God's work in the world. This restoration process also involves making sure that black voices are represented in theological discussions and interpretations. For too long, black people have been excluded from shaping the conversation about the Bible. Theological scholarship and religious education need to include diverse perspectives that reflect the experiences of black people. Black theologians, pastors, and scholars must be given the platform to share their insights and interpretations, which will allow for a richer, more inclusive understanding of the Bible. Furthermore, it's essential for black communities to reclaim and reinterpret their own spiritual narratives. For centuries, black people have adapted the Bible to their circumstances, finding strength in the scriptures despite the erasure and distortion of their presence. From the spirituals sung during slavery to the civil rights movement's use of biblical imagery, black communities have consistently found ways to connect with the Bible and use it as a source of resistance, empowerment, and hope. The task now is to continue this work, ensuring that future generations are equipped with an understanding of the Bible that reflects their place in God's story, allowing them to build a faith that is rooted in both cultural pride and spiritual connection. Restoring black representation in biblical history is not just about correcting the record. It's about reclaiming spiritual and cultural identity. By doing this, we restore the dignity and worth of black individuals, reaffirming that their story has always been part of the larger divine narrative. This restoration has the power to heal not only personal and communal wounds, but also to inspire a new generation of black people who can see themselves in the Bible as active participants in God's mission. When black people are able to reclaim their rightful place in biblical history, they will find a renewed sense of purpose, pride, and spiritual fulfillment that has been denied to them for far too long. The importance of reclaiming black people's place in biblical history extends far beyond individual healing. It has the potential to shift the collective consciousness of black communities. For centuries, the erasure of black people from sacred texts has contributed to the sense that black lives, both in the spiritual and worldly sense, are secondary or less important. But when black people are able to see themselves reflected in the Bible, it begins to challenge these deeply ingrained beliefs and empowers them to reclaim their worth. This transformation begins with understanding that the Bible is not just a book about salvation. It is also a book about identity. The stories within it are not just historical accounts. They are blueprints for how we understand who we are in relation to God, to one another, and to the world around us. The psychological impact of seeing yourself in the Bible cannot be overstated. It fosters a sense of belonging, validation, and purpose. It tells black people that they are not outsiders in God's plan, but integral parts of a divine story that spans generations and cultures. For too long, the church has operated under the assumption that black people's history and cultural contributions have no place in biblical teachings. But by reintroducing these lost or overlooked figures, we make space for a fuller understanding of God's work. Figures like Zipporah, Moses' wife, an African woman whose story is often overlooked in biblical teachings, or the Ethiopian eunuch, whose conversion is a pivotal moment in early Christianity, must be brought to the forefront. Their inclusion does not just correct the historical record. It allows Black people to see that their experiences, their struggles, and their divine purpose are woven into the fabric of God's plan. The power of reclaiming these biblical narratives goes beyond theology. It is about restoring pride and dignity. When Black people see themselves in the pages of the Bible, they begin to understand that their story is not one of exclusion, but of inclusion. It tells them that their heritage is sacred, that their ancestors played a crucial role in the divine unfolding of history, and that their lives have always been valuable in the eyes of God. This reclamation is also a spiritual liberation. By restoring Black representation in the Bible, we free Black people from the psychological and spiritual constraints that have kept them from fully embracing their faith. The stories in the Bible are not just about the past, they are about the present and future. They provide a vision for how we should live, how we should treat one another, and how we should relate to God. When Black people are able to see themselves in these stories, they gain access to that vision of divine purpose and hope, reclaiming the fullness of their spiritual inheritance. The impact of this restoration reaches beyond Black communities. As we expand the representation of people in the Bible, we begin to change the way all people view the history of humanity. The Bible has always been a universal text, offering wisdom and teachings for people of all races and backgrounds. By ensuring that Black people's presence is acknowledged and celebrated, we enrich the entire spiritual community. We remind everyone that God's story is not just the story of a select few, but of all people, regardless of race, culture, or background. Reclaiming Black presence in the Bible is ultimately a step toward healing, not just for Black people, but for humanity as a whole. It is an acknowledgement that the sacred texts and teachings have always belonged to all people, that no one has been left out or excluded from the story of God's love and redemption. By restoring Black people to their rightful place in biblical history, we move closer to a world where every individual, regardless of race, can find themselves reflected in the divine narrative and embrace their place in God's kingdom. The journey to restoring Black people's rightful place in biblical history is not without its challenges. One of the biggest obstacles lies in the long-standing theological and cultural biases that have shaped the way we understand the Bible. For centuries, the image of Jesus and other biblical figures has been depicted through a lens that does not reflect the racial and ethnic diversity of the time. These representations have often been centered on white European characteristics, which not only distorts the historical reality, but also perpetuates the idea that Black people are not part of the divine narrative. This challenge is further compounded by the fact that many churches and religious institutions have been slow to embrace these corrections. In some instances, the idea of diversifying biblical representation is met with resistance. There are those who argue that altering depictions of biblical figures or acknowledging the role of Black people in biblical history is unnecessary or even controversial. This resistance comes from deeply ingrained traditions and, in many cases, a lack of awareness or understanding about the impact of these omissions on Black people's spiritual well-being. However, the longer these inaccuracies persist, the longer Black communities remain disconnected from their rightful place in the biblical story. Another challenge in this restoration process is the lack of education and awareness surrounding the historical context of the Bible. Many people are unaware of the fact that the Bible's central figures were from the Middle East, a region that has always been diverse in terms of race, culture, and ethnicity. The idea that the biblical world was exclusively white is a misconception that has been perpetuated through centuries of biased interpretation and portrayal. In order to correct this, there needs to be a broader effort to educate people about the racial and cultural diversity of biblical times. as well as the important roles that African peoples played in the biblical narrative. Addressing these issues also requires confronting the discomfort that comes with acknowledging the historical misrepresentations. For some, it is difficult to face the fact that religious traditions, which are meant to be a source of unity and healing, have been used to perpetuate exclusion and division. Yet, it is essential to confront these truths if we are to move forward. By recognizing the harm caused by centuries of erasure and misrepresentation, we can begin to heal and create a more inclusive, truthful understanding of the Bible. This is not about rewriting history. It is about acknowledging the full truth of the past, so that we can move toward a future of spiritual healing, unity, and justice. The restoration of Black representation in the Bible is also a collective effort. It is not solely the responsibility of religious leaders or scholars. It is a task for communities of faith as a whole. Churches, schools, and families must work together to reclaim these lost narratives. Religious institutions must be willing to open their doors to a more inclusive and diverse understanding of the Bible, one that reflects the reality of its ancient context. This may involve revising curricula, incorporating more diverse theological perspectives, and ensuring that Black people are represented in church leadership and biblical scholarship. Moreover, reclaiming Black presence in the Bible is not only about spiritual healing, but also about restoring pride in one's heritage. The erasure of Black people from biblical history has contributed to a sense of shame about cultural identity, especially for young Black people growing up in religious communities. By restoring these figures and their contributions to the Bible, we give Black individuals the opportunity to see themselves as valuable participants in God's divine plan. This can have a profound impact on self-esteem, community cohesion, and overall mental health, as it provides a sense of spiritual validation and belonging that has been denied for far too long. In addition to the institutional and educational changes, there is a need for individual action. Black people must reclaim their spiritual identity by looking for the figures and narratives that reflect their experiences within the Bible. This may involve a personal journey of rediscovery, reading the Bible with new eyes, learning about the historical context, and finding connections between one's own cultural heritage and the stories of faith. By taking ownership of their place in the biblical narrative, Black individuals can begin to reshape their relationship with both the Bible and their faith. The path to restoring Black representation in the Bible is not easy, and it will take time, but the effort is worth it. By confronting the erasure, challenging the misconceptions, and reclaiming the narratives, we can create a future where all people, regardless of race, can see themselves in the divine story. This restoration will not only bring healing to Black communities, but will also enrich the broader Christian faith, making it more inclusive and representative of the diverse world we live in. It is a step toward justice, healing, and the fulfillment of God's promise that all people, from every nation, tribe, and tongue, are part of His plan. The restoration of Black people's rightful place in biblical history goes beyond the academic or theological. It's a matter of justice, healing, and reclaiming dignity. When these erasures are addressed, the psychological impact on individuals and communities begins to reverse. But this is only the beginning. The process of restoration also calls for a shift in how the broader Christian church and society at large view the role of Black people in the story of God. For too long, the church has failed to engage with the cultural and racial diversity of the Bible, reinforcing the idea that Black people's place in the spiritual story is marginal at best. One of the biggest challenges to this restoration process is how deeply embedded these historical misrepresentations are within religious practices and teachings. The Bible has been interpreted through a lens that largely ignores or distorts the roles Black people have played in the sacred narrative. This, in turn, has perpetuated a cycle of racial injustice, where the church has often sided with cultural forces that seek to marginalize black people. The task, therefore, is not simply about correcting isolated facts, but about re-examining the entire system of biblical interpretation that has led to these erasures. This shift must take place at all levels of the church, from church leadership to congregants, from biblical scholars to Sunday school teachers. It requires a collective effort to change the narratives that have long excluded or misrepresented black people, as well as to celebrate the diverse ethnicities, cultures, and histories that shaped biblical events. When churches and religious communities open their eyes to the fullness of biblical history, they are not just making room for black people, but they are enriching the entire faith. The recognition of black people's presence in the Bible will, in turn, deepen the spiritual lives of all Christians by highlighting the multifaceted nature of God's creation and His work in the world. Incorporating black representation into biblical teachings is not merely about adding a few characters or stories to the narrative. It's about acknowledging the crucial roles that black individuals and communities have always played in the story of faith. When black people see themselves as active participants in the divine plan, it reinforces their identity as children of God, deeply loved and integral to the larger narrative of salvation. This restoration serves as a form of spiritual empowerment, reclaiming what has been lost or hidden, and using it as a foundation for building stronger, more connected faith communities. It affirms that every individual, regardless of race or background, has a meaningful place in God's kingdom. Moreover, when the broader Christian community begins to embrace the idea of diversity and inclusion within the Bible, it sends a powerful message of unity. The church, as a body of believers, can no longer afford to ignore or sideline the contributions of black people in the biblical narrative. The church must commit to a more inclusive understanding of biblical history, one that not only recognizes the diversity within the text, but also actively seeks to include and uplift the stories of those who have been excluded for so long. This approach goes beyond mere representation. It is about fostering a faith that reflects the inclusiveness of God's love for all people. While this work of restoration is necessary, it is not easy. For many, it involves confronting uncomfortable truths about the history of the church and the role it has played in perpetuating racism and exclusion. This process of confrontation is often met with resistance, both from those who are unaware of the problem and from those who may fear the loss of tradition or control. However, the effort to restore black representation in the Bible is not about dismantling tradition. It is about expanding the narrative to be more true to the original biblical context and to the diversity of people God created. The restoration of black presence in biblical history is also about healing generational trauma. The long history of exclusion and misrepresentation has left deep scars within black communities, scars that are passed down from one generation to the next. By confronting this erasure and restoring black people's rightful place in biblical history, we begin to heal those wounds. This restoration can provide a sense of spiritual fulfillment, pride, and connection to a deeper, more authentic faith. It can heal the trauma caused by centuries of being told that black people were unimportant or secondary in God's story. When black individuals begin to see themselves reflected in the Bible, it reaffirms their sense of divine purpose and restores their faith in the power of God's love for all people. In this way, the restoration process is about more than just reclaiming biblical history. It's about changing the way the church functions as a whole. It's about creating a more inclusive, just, and spiritually vibrant community where everyone, regardless of race, feels a deep and lasting connection to the divine narrative. This is a vision of the church that reflects the true nature of God's kingdom, where all people are seen, valued, and included in the story of salvation. It is a vision of the future, one where the church embodies the love and inclusivity that Christ modeled throughout his life. By restoring Black representation in the Bible, we are not only reclaiming history, we are building a better, more united future. As we move toward the restoration of Black representation in biblical history, it's essential to recognize that this is not just about correcting a historical oversight. It's about actively reshaping how faith communities understand the nature of the Bible, the nature of God, and the nature of humanity. Reclaiming Black presence in the Bible is a process that demands commitment from both individuals and institutions. It requires a shift in how biblical texts are taught, preached, and understood, opening up space for the diverse peoples and cultures who are part of the biblical narrative. For too long, the church has predominantly reflected a homogeneous understanding of biblical figures, often casting them in a way that overlooks their true cultural and ethnic identities. This erasure has not only denied Black people their rightful place, but has also limited the richness of the Christian faith, preventing the church from fully embracing the diversity that God intended. This process of restoration involves more than just revisiting old texts. It's about reimagining how the Bible can be a living, breathing document that speaks to the experiences and histories of all people. It means acknowledging the deep spiritual truths and stories that have been hidden and making them accessible for future generations. By restoring Black presence in the Bible, we allow people to find themselves in the stories of faith, allowing them to claim the promises and power of the Scriptures for themselves. It means teaching the Bible not only as a sacred text, but as a story that belongs to everyone, regardless of race or background. One of the most profound impacts of restoring Black representation in the Bible is the healing that takes place within individuals and communities. The erasure of Black people from biblical history has caused deep spiritual and emotional wounds. These wounds, though often unseen, have affected generations, fostering a sense of inferiority and disconnection from both God and their community. When Black people begin to see themselves in the Bible, not as background characters or secondary figures, but as powerful divine participants in God's plan, it has the potential to heal those wounds and restore their sense of self-worth. This restoration is more than a theological exercise. It is a form of spiritual and emotional reconciliation, where individuals can look to the Bible and see themselves reflected in the divine narrative. Moreover, when Black people see themselves represented in the Bible, it challenges the false narratives that have been used to justify racial oppression throughout history. The idea that Black people are inferior or less than in the eyes of God is a lie that has been perpetuated through centuries of misinterpretation and exclusion. Restoring Black presence in the Bible is a step toward dismantling those lies and affirming that Black people, like everyone else, are created in the image of God and have an important place in His plan. This process not only restores Black people's identity, but also helps to heal the broader societal divisions that have been perpetuated by racism and exclusion. The Bible, when understood in its full diversity, can become a powerful tool for justice, equality, and healing, not just for Black people, but for everyone. This journey toward restoration is not just a matter of theological correction, it is an act of liberation. When Black people can see themselves in the sacred text, they are liberated from the spiritual and psychological chains that have held them back for so long. They are no longer confined to a place of spiritual inferiority, but can instead claim their rightful place as beloved children of God, participants in His divine plan. This liberation extends beyond the individual and impacts entire communities, allowing them to reclaim their cultural heritage and spiritual inheritance. It fosters a deeper sense of connection to one's faith, to one's community, and to the broader narrative of humanity. The work of restoring Black representation in the Bible also carries with it a responsibility, both to the past and to future generations. The past has shaped the present, and for Black communities, the erasure of their presence in biblical history has had lasting effects. It is up to those of us who are engaged in this process of restoration to ensure that these truths are passed on, that future generations are able to see themselves in the Bible, and that they understand their rightful place in God's kingdom. This responsibility involves not only revisiting the Bible, but also reshaping how we educate and engage with Scripture in churches, schools, and communities. And some does. It means actively confronting the historical misinterpretations and erasures that have marginalized Black people, and replacing them with a more accurate, inclusive, and truthful understanding of biblical history. Restoring Black presence in the Bible is a transformative process that requires ongoing commitment. It's not a one-time correction, but a continual effort to include, uplift, and celebrate the contributions of Black people in the biblical narrative. It is a process of healing, reconciliation, and empowerment. As we move forward, we must remain committed to this work, knowing that it is a step toward a more just, inclusive, and spiritually rich future. One in which every person, regardless of race, can find their place in God's divine story. The impact of restoring Black representation in the Bible extends far beyond theological or historical accuracy. It speaks directly to the emotional and psychological well-being of individuals, families, and entire communities. When Black people are able to see their presence acknowledged in the sacred text, it restores a sense of pride and connection to their spiritual heritage. For generations, Black people have been told, directly or indirectly, that they had no place in the divine story, and this message has caused deep wounds. These wounds, often invisible to the outside world, have been passed down through generations, affecting everything from self-worth to communal identity. By reintroducing Black people into biblical history, we begin the process of healing these wounds, helping individuals to reconnect with their spiritual ancestors and their rightful place in God's narrative. At the core of this restoration is the reclamation of dignity. For Black people, seeing themselves reflected in the Bible as powerful, wise, and influential figures restores a sense of spiritual self-respect. It is not just about inserting new figures into the biblical narrative. It's about affirming the value and worth of Black lives in the eyes of God. When Black children see images of biblical characters who look like them, who share their heritage, they begin to understand that they are not excluded from God's promises. This validation is crucial, as it builds a foundation for self-esteem and confidence that can extend far beyond religious practices, influencing every aspect of life, from personal relationships to career aspirations. Moreover, this restoration has a profound effect on the collective sense of Black identity. Historically, Black communities have had to rely on a range of cultural, social, and spiritual practices to preserve their identity in the face of oppression. While these practices have been invaluable in preserving Black culture, the erasure of Black presence from biblical history has left a gap in understanding how spiritual identity and cultural heritage intersect. By reconnecting Black people to their rightful place in the Bible, we bridge this gap, reinforcing the idea that Black spirituality and culture have always been integral to the greater Christian story. This sense of interconnectedness fosters a strong, unified community where individuals feel proud of their heritage and confident in their spiritual journey. The psychological impact of this reclamation goes beyond just a sense of identity. It also has the power to shift the way Black people engage with society. When Black people are able to see their divine worth acknowledged in the Bible, it reinforces their understanding that they are valuable and important in the eyes of God, and by extension, in the eyes of society. The psychological shift that occurs when Black people reclaim their place in the divine narrative is one of empowerment. It becomes harder for society's negative stereotypes and harmful narratives to take root when Black people see their own worth reflected in the most sacred text of the world. This empowered sense of self carries with it the potential to inspire others, to challenge societal injustices, and to foster a greater sense of unity and pride within the community. The healing that comes from restoring Black representation in the Bible is also a step toward healing racial divisions within the church. The church, in its truest form, is meant to be a space for all people to come together, to worship, and to find common ground in God's love. When Black people are excluded from the biblical narrative, the church becomes divided, unable to fully fulfill its purpose of unity and inclusivity. By restoring Black presence in the Bible, the church begins to heal, becoming a space where every member, regardless of race or background, can see themselves as equal participants in God's kingdom. This inclusivity leads to a more holistic, compassionate church, one that is fully reflective of the diverse body of Christ. Furthermore, this restoration is not just a benefit for Black communities. It enriches the entire Christian faith. The Bible, when understood in its full context, offers a much richer and more complex understanding of God's love and purpose for humanity. The inclusion of Black people in biblical history allows for a broader, more inclusive perspective on salvation, divine purpose, and spiritual destiny. This inclusivity expands the way Christians from all backgrounds understand the Bible and deepens their connection to the text. By embracing the diversity of biblical figures, we open the door to a deeper understanding of God's love for all people, regardless of their race or cultural heritage. Ultimately, the process of restoring Black representation in the Bible is an act of spiritual and cultural reconciliation. It is an opportunity for Black people to reclaim their place in God's story and to find healing from the psychological wounds of exclusion and erasure. It is an opportunity for the church to grow into a more inclusive, compassionate community that reflects the true diversity of God's creation. And it is an opportunity for all Christians to experience the richness and fullness of the divine narrative, where all people are seen, valued, and included in God's eternal plan. The work of restoration is not just about historical correction. It is about spiritual healing, cultural restoration, and the creation of a more just, unified world. If this video has sparked something in you, it's time to take action. Share this message with others who need to hear it, and let's start a conversation that brings healing to communities. Don't forget to subscribe so we can continue uncovering the truths that empower us all. Reclaim your story. Reclaim your place. Let's restore what was lost, together.